let's start with this week's recap. So in this week, you have learned about the NMR spectroscopy. So basic principles and fundamentals of NMR spectroscopy, the concept of shielding, de-shielding, and the chemical shifts in NMR and other uh, fundamentals related to the NMR. So the information that we get from the NMR is the chemical shift. So first of all, the chemical shift like of proton or 13 carbon in NMR, that will provide the information of the structure of the compound in terms of the bonding and also the electronic effects and which are present in the in our material or polymer. Then we have a coupling constant. So that is associated with the fine structure of the NMR spectrum, and the generally the spin coupling related information we can get from the coupling constant. Then relaxation time. So only spin active nuclei will have an impact on the NMR signal width and have other significant effects. Then the integration. So this is related to the area. Just a second. So the integration is related to the area under the. So the integration is the area under the signal or the curve, and this is proportional to the number of spin active nuclei. So this is for the quantitative analysis basically. So we have learned about the various spectroscopic techniques like ultraviolet, which involves the electronic transition. In the infrared, we have read about the vibrational changes which occur in the molecule. That is how we get the signal in the infrared. And microwave uses the rotational signals. So similarly, in the radio wave, we can see the nuclear spin, and that is what we can uh, detect from the NMR spectroscopy. Like upon interacting with the radio waves, how the nuclear spin is getting changed. So that can be determined using the NMR spectroscopy. So the NMR spectroscopy is a technique used for determination of the structure of organic molecules, and it is also related to the change in the direction of spin oriented as a result of the absorption of radio frequency in the material. So what is spin? Plus half and minus half is the general spin that we see in most of the elements, as you can see here in the hydrogen, carbon, phosphorus, fluorine, and silicon also. So, but not all atoms will give the spin. So, suppose for hydrogen, like one edge, that is the proton, that will give the half spin. That two edge will give one. So and similarly for carbon, the carbon 12 will not give any will not have any spin, and carbon 13 will give the spin of half. So that is how the with the isotropic nature of the uh, element, the spin will change. So the physical origin of NMR spectroscope. So it is dependent on the spin act. It is only for the spin active nuclei, and the nuclei of an atom must have behave like a tiny magnet. So when we apply a magnetic field, it will try to arrange itself, the arrange its spin as with the like with respect to the magnetic field. Suppose the magnetic field is in this direction, so this side south and this upside north. So the atom will try to align it with this magnetic field, and it can be either plus half or minus half. So and here this should not be zero. Like the spin should have some value. It cannot be zero. So for the elements which are having spin quantum number zero, so those will not give uh, any signal in the NMR. And the spinning nuclei. So here is an example of a proton. This behaves as a spinning charge and generates a magnetic field, as I already told. And the resulting spin magnet has a magnetic momentum that is called mu, and it is proportional to the spin. And also the angular frequency. So we will be needing it in the later stage. So omega is equals to 2 pi omega, 2 pi mu, that you should remember. So, so coming to the basic principle, in the suppose nuclei has a spin quantum number of half, so that will be spherical in nature. So number of possible orientation can be 2i plus 1 orientation. So for 1h the I is equals to half, and so we can calculate the possible orientation for this one. So it will be 2 into half plus 1, that is 2. So for the spherical, for this kind of nuclei which is having a spin half, we can get possible orientation, two possible orientation. So as you can see here, like upward or downward. But if we have a nuclei which is having more spin number, that is more than half. So suppose this boron or chlorine or oxygen, or suppose 2H or 14N. So for those, the uh, like that will not be the structure, spin will not be in the spherical nature. It can be quadruple. So suppose we have four possible orientations, so it can be like this. So this is for the mm, nuclei which is having a higher spin quantum. Then so how to calculate that? So the magnitude of the nuclear spin angular momentum, this is, that is p, can be calculated as so this is equals to the uh, h naught under root I uh, uh, multiplied by I plus 1. So I we know that is the spin constant, and h naught is the Planck's constant. So h naught is equals to h by 2 pi. Sorry, h is the Planck's constant, and h naught is equals to h by 2 pi. And the magnetic moment mu can then be determined from this angular momentum. So mu into the gyrometric ratio, mu is equals to gyrometric ratio into the angular momentum. So that is how we can calculate the magnetic momentum of the nuclei. And then if you want to sorry.
பரபரன்னு சவுண்ட் வரலையே உங்களுக்கு? ஏதோ ஒரு வயர் கருகுற சவுண்ட் எனக்கு நல்லா கேட்டுச்சு. இல்ல உள்ள இருந்து
Yeah. So with the, so continuing, so the direction of the spin can also be determined. So suppose uh, we want to know at what angle the spin is happening. So with the help of the h naught and I, we can calculate at what angle it will be aligned. So that theta is the angle with respect to the z-axis basically, and it is also called as the magic angle. So at that point we can see we know that that is aligned to the magnetic field. So we can get the maximum what signal from that. So this can be determined using the formula cos theta is equals to m h naught divided by h naught under root I bracket I plus 1. So as we know, h naught value we can get from here, and I we know for the particular nuclei. So with the help of that we can calculate that. So m can be either that that is the same thing, plus half or minus half. So with that we can get the theta. So if it is plus half, then theta is equals to 54.7. If it is minus, then it should be divided by it should be subtracted from 180 degree. So it will be around 125.3. So this is with respect to the z-axis. So now there is a, so how the magnetic field is is playing role in aligning the nuclei. So here we can see the external magnetic field is applied to the nuclei, and so suppose the nuclei was oriented like this in earlier, like previously before applying any field. So before applying any field, the spin was something like this for the nuclei, and when we applied the magnetic field, it will try to align. It will try to align like this or like this. So if it is against the magnetic field, then it is called beta spin state. That is the high energy state. So you can see in the diagram here. energy level diagram. So if there is a beta spin, that will be higher state. However, if the spin of the nuclei is uh, aligned with the direction of the field, then it is called as alpha spin. So this is low state, low energy state. So here the alpha phase we can get, alpha spin we can get at the lower energy level. So from alpha to beta, the if the spin has to take, then the nuclei should absorb this much of energy. So that is delta is equals to h nu. So if the molecule or nuclei absorbs delta h, delta E is equals to h nu, this much of energy, then it will uh, shift the alignment. Like from alpha to beta, it will change the alignment. So again, so the alpha is the lower energy, that is half plus half, and the beta is the higher energy, that is represented as minus half spin. So minus because it is opposite to the external magnetic field. You can remember it like that. So that alignment is basically called as resonance. That is why nuclear magnetic resonance. We call it as nuclear NMR, nuclear magnetic resonance. So again that we know delta is equals to h nu. Here again h is the Planck's constant and nu is the frequency of the magnetic field or radiation. So in this case we are using the magnetic field. So then it is directly proportional to the B naught. So that is the spin of. So this will provide the. So the delta E will provide the difference in the energy or radiation necessary for the nuclear spin to shift state. So that is also expressed as delta is directly proportional to V naught. So now if we put delta E is equals to h nu here, so h nu is directly proportional to V naught. That means nu, that is the frequency, is directly proportional to the V naught. And so V naught is the strength of the external magnetic field basically. So therefore the frequency, we can say that the frequency of resonance nu is directly proportional to the strength of the external magnetic field, that is V naught. And the proportionality constant, if we put after removing the sign, so we generally the here the proportionality constant is gamma by 2 pi. So gamma is the gyromagnetic ratio. So this constant is just to measure how strong the nuclear magnetic field is. So nucleus magnetic field we can determine, that is represented as Larmor frequency, and different spin active nuclei will have different Larmor frequencies. Uh, so continuing with the NMR principle, so we know that the relation between the applied magnetic field and radio frequency we got. So from this derivation, we know that the relation between the frequency of a particular molecule, that is the Larmor frequency, and the relation of that with the magnetic field. So here V naught is the applied magnetic field, as I have told. Then V is the Larmor frequency or the radio frequency, and gamma is the gyromagnetic ratio. So it is different for different proton or nuclei. So for the proton it is 26.752 per second per gauge, and for 46,000. And for the carbon it is 13 carbon, for 13 carbon it is 6.7. So now again, if we the energy gap will be different for different magnetic field also. So as we increase the magnetic field, so suppose earlier it is 1.4 Tesla, then after increasing, the energy gap will keep on increasing. So as we know, because the applied magnetic field is proportional to the frequency, so then we need to put more frequency to get the same change in the spin. So for increasing the magnetic field, with the increasing the magnetic field, the radio frequency has to increase to get the desired change in the spin. And so this implies that 14,000 Gauss field is required for 60 megahertz of proton. Megahertz proton is required to flip a proton. So that much megahertz frequency that should be. It is required to flip up protons, so to change the spin. So around 14,000 Gauss field is required. So now you know how much like important it is to to know the relation between these two, to get the proper signal out of the out of our sample. So so how it is happening? So first, the RF, that is the radio frequency, is getting absorbed for the in the nuclei, and then it jumps to the upper level and flip itself. Then after uh, at the excited level, it will radiate some kind of energy in the form of emission or relaxation. So when it tries to come back to the original state, it will emit some kind of radiation and if it is less than the if it is less, then the relaxation will happen. So if uh, so it can give the then it will give the NMR signal. So first it will absorb the radio frequency and then jump to the higher state, and then upon relaxation it will release the NMR signal, and that is what we detect from the basically from the detector. So how much signal is getting absorbed, that is what we get in the peak. So NMR absorption peak, that is how we get. So for the beta spin, so the absorption of photon, and for the alpha spin, that flip or how much it has taken energy taken to flip itself, so that we can detect. So a nucleus is in resonance when it is irradiated with RF photons having energy equal to the energy difference between the spin states. And under these conditions, a proton in the alpha spin, it will absorb a photon and flip itself in the beta form. And that is how we get the NMR absorption signal or the peak. So again, there are multiple uh, atoms here. So different nucleus. So different nucleus will have a different spin, and it will absorb different uh, radiation. So same radiation, but the cumulative effect will be there. So again, the number will be varying. So suppose n plus is the number of spin in the lower energy state, and n minus is the number of spin in the upper energy state. So in the so the nuclei, different nucleus are present at the alpha level and different are present at the beta level. So when the magnetic field is applied, some of those from the alpha will go to the beta, but not all will go. So that we can calculate using the Boltzmann distribution, and this describes the population of the nuclei in each state. So in the uh, lower energy state and in the upper energy state. So with the help of the Boltzmann distribution, we can calculate the population. So the signal is proportional to the population difference between the states. And so the necessary condition for nuclear transition uh, is that the small but finite amount of nucleus must present in the lower energy level to get a continuous signal. So Uh, so the condition is there should be some or finite amount of nucleus should be present at the lower scale, lower energy level, so that the transition keeps on happening. So from the lower state it will go to the upper state, and then it will relax back, come back to the original state, and then again. So the transition will be continuous in that case. And so again, if it gets saturated, so suppose the number is equal, a number of the nucleus in the lower the lower energy level and the upper energy level both are equal, that means the ratio becomes 1, then it is called the saturation peak. Then no signal will be coming, because now both the levels are full, so we cannot get any signal out of it. And so that is what the saturation condition is, that the population between the energy state becomes same, then observed resonance signal will fade out, that is called the saturation. Then in the relaxation process, there are certain processes by which small or finite number of nucleus must be maintained in the lower energy level, as I have already told, for continuous signal. So here, as we mentioned, that this is a necessary condition that some or small amount of nucleus has to be present at the lower energy level. So and so to get the continuous signal, so the process should be spontaneous. Now, depending upon the energy difference between the spin level, when high energy nucleus come back to the low energy state, they can relax. So the radiation less emission will happen, and the time required to relax a nucleus from high energy state to low energy state is known as the relaxation time. So the process can happen in two ways. Spin lattice relaxation, that is longitudinal. So the relaxation time can be denoted as T1, and for the spin relaxation, it is the transverse. So the relaxation time can be denoted as T2. We'll talk about it more about it. So uh, so now the principle of shielding and deshielding. So what happens to the nucleus when if it is in the deshielded form? So that means that so both deshielding and shielding require different amount of energy for the changing the spin. So suppose if it is deshielded, that means first it was in the alpha state, and after absorbing the RF radiation, it will change itself or flip itself to the beta state. So it will absorb very high frequency. So it will require very high frequency. So we have to apply more uh, Tesla power of the magnetic field. So the energy required in the deshielded form will be very high. However, in the case of shielded, so the suppose the uh, nuclei is having a spin which is less than 90 degrees. So in that case, to align itself or to go itself, align itself against the magnetic field, it will require very less energy because it is already less than the 90 degree or 180 degree. Basically 180 degree, but here it is shown that it is less than 90 degrees. So it will require very less energy. So very low frequency is required. So very low Tesla level of frequency is required in that case. So the energy required for spin active nuclei to go from alpha to beta is greater for deshielded and uh, high and lesser for shielded, as we know, because it does not need to spin whole of 180 degree. But however, we need to spin it a total 180 degrees or almost 180. So in that case, we require more energy, as I will, as I already explained. So from in the NMR spectra also, for the shielded hydrogen, suppose the energy or the peak will be at a lower energy level, but for the deshielded hydrogen, the peak will be at the higher energy level. So that is the difference. So how will we identify as unknown sample in NMR? So for different isomers, like suppose we have a this C3H7Cl. So we can represent it as 1 chloropropane or as 2 chloropropane. So now we have two different chemical structures. So in the 1 chloropropane, the chlorine is attached at the first carbon. However, in the 2 chloropropane, the chlorine is attached at the second carbon. So here we can see that this is the most de-shielded, then this is the most shielded, and the middle one is the minimum shielded. Why this is de-shielded? Because the electron of this carbon atom is having affinity with the chlorine. So chlorine is very highly electronegative. So it will try to align the electron or the nuclei in a particular direction of its electronegative field. And if we apply a magnetic field, then it will uh, be against the magnetic field, and it will take more. So angle required to arrange itself will be higher. It will be 90 degree or more than that. So in that case, the energy required will be higher. So that is how this is the de-shielded one, and then this medium shielded because it is in the middle, and this is the far away. So this is most shielded. And if we see in this structure, the these two so proton, if we are talking about, so these two protons are shielded equally, and this one middle one is the most de-shielded. So the peak will be like this. So for the shielded, it will be at lower energy, and for de-shielded, it will be at higher energy. And in this case, so this is the most de-shielded, so it is at higher energy. Then medium shielded is in middle, and the most shielded will be at lower energy. So as we know, the chemical shift can happen when the structure changes. So for different functional groups, as we have seen in the FTIR also, for different functional groups we have different. So sometimes the shift can occur, uh, and for different functional groups, a particular place is assigned in the spectra, like where the that functional group can be, uh, the peak for that functional group can be obtained. So here also the same thing is happening. And if we talk about the chemical shift, we have to first take a reference. So generally TMS, that is a selenide that is used for the reference sample. That is used as a reference sample. So the peak for this generally comes at 0 ppm. And for with respect to that TMS, we can uh, check the chemical shift of different functional groups or molecules. So suppose we have an aromatic ring, the it will be far away from the TMS, so it will be at a higher frequency. And for the this electronegative atom is attached, then electronegative element is attached, then it will be somewhere here. And if there is no electronegative atom, but the double bond is there, or less electronegative atom, then it will be somewhere in this range. So that is how we can get different. We can get to know that what kind of functional group is present in our sample. So why TMS? So why do we use TMS? Because it has 12 equivalent protons. So all protons are in an equivalent position, and a very small amount of that will give a large peak. So it is very highly active. So silicon is electropositive than proton, and it is chemically inert. It can also be removed if the sample has to be recovered, and is highly volatile. So therefore we can separate it out from the sample, and it is soluble in most of the organic solvents. So the most other commonly used standard for water soluble compound is this compound. So it has a silicon, then sodium also. So the sodium salt of 4,4-dimethyl 4-silapentane 1 sulfonic acid is used for water soluble compounds, and this one is used for organic solvents because it is soluble in organic solvents. So yeah, so as we know that the de-shielding will be having very high energy, and it will require very high frequency. So delta value will be higher for this, and it is downfield. And for the shielded one, it will be upfield, so it require less, so less energy, less frequency, and the peak will come at lower delta value. So uh, so this is again a comparison of different atoms. So suppose we have a hydrogen only, that the peak will come at very less delta. So if we increase the more electronegative atoms, so if we keep on increasing like nitrogen, then oxygen, then fluorine, so the peak shifting will start happening at the higher delta value. So that is how like they wanted to compare it. So that is how we can compare different if different electronegative atoms are present in our sample. Similarly for chlorine, bromine, or again, we can see if the sp2 have hybridization, sp3 hybridization, that will also change the value of, or shift of the peak. So for different functional groups, the peak shift are again mentioned. So we do not need to remember it by heart, but we need to know, like we should at least get an idea out of it, that if our sample is containing an electronegative group or triple bond or double bond, then at what range it should come. So that idea should be there, but we do not need to memorize it. So we can always go back to the standard charts and refer to these shifts. So the factors which are affecting the chemical shift are substitution and hybridization, and anisotropic effect, then mesomeric effect, inductive effect, and hydrogen bond. So these are the some of the factors which can affect the chemical shift. So substitution and hybridization. So as I told that sp2, sp3, sp hybridization will influence the resonance. So for the sp3, the for the ch or for the proton, delta will be around 1 to 4. Then for sp2, it will increase to 5 to 7. Then for sp2 aromatic, if it is aromatic compound, then from 7 to 9. Then for carbonyl sp2, it is 8 to 10. Then for only sp, it is somewhere at 3. So that is how it increases, and for sp it is at 3. For carbon or carbon nuclei, it starts from 10 to 50, then 100 to 150. It keeps on increasing to 200, and then for sp it is 50 to 80. And for substitution of proton by carbon, so here if we have r ch, and again we keep on increasing the r, that is the again another substitution is happening. So with that, the delta value will keep on increasing. Now, what is an anisotropic effect? So, anisotropy is the electron density in bonds is not same in all directions. So, suppose we have an alkene. Here, the positive are on this side, but in the x-axis we have negative charge. And for alkyne, the positive are far away and negative are very close to each other. And we are applying the magnetic field in this direction. And for a benzene ring, we know the positive will be upper side and negative will be very far away. So this kind of anisotropy also affects the signal, NMR signal. So the diamagnetic shield always reduces or subtract the apparent magnetic field at the proton, and consequently is a source of positive shield. So this so the positive charge is the shielded region, the negative charge is the de-shielded region, and that is how we are applying the magnetic field. And so the molecule itself is having its own field, and that is represented as like this in this for the benzene, and like this for the other alkene and alkyne. So the beta naught plus beta E is the effective moment for this one, and for this one it is in the opposite direction. So it is beta naught minus beta E, B naught minus B. So B naught is the applied field, and B is the field of itself. So if it is in the same direction, then it is plus. So the effective will be plus of the both, and if it is in the opposite direction, then the effective moment will be subtraction of both the fields.
ಕ್ಲಾಸ್ ನಡೆದವ.
Yeah. So then the mesomeric effect or inductive. So it is a permanent state of the polarization. So the electron density is in a bond between the two unlike atoms is not uniform. So that is how the mesomeric effect will take place. So one side the electron density will be higher, and the other side or towards the negative electronegative atom, the electron density will be less. Sorry, in the electronegative the density will be higher than as compared to the other one. So that is creating a mesomeric effect. So this will affect the hydrogen bonding. So if an electron withdrawing is happening, because of the that will cause the de-shielding, and the hydrogen bonding effect will occur. So the hydrogen bonding it shifts the resonance signal of a proton to lower field or higher frequency. So So if you're varying the concentration, then phenol concentration with different concentration of CdCl. So the Cl3 is more electronegative. So if we increase the concentration, suppose from 1% we are increasing to 5% and 10%. So the hydrogen affinity with the oxygen, and that bond will be having some effects. So it can be seen from the spectra that at 1% it was around 4.34. Then we are increasing it. So at 5% it is increased to 5.95. Then at 10% it is increased to 7.45. So that is how if we are increasing the concentration of CdCl3 in the phenol, that is what we can see the frequency is shifting to the higher, the peak is shifting to the higher frequency or higher delta values. Then there is a spin-spin coupling. So here, as you can see, that multiple peaks are coming for a same, like for a single spin. So how it is happening? Why we are getting multiple peaks? So as you can see from here, from in the third carbon, we get 3 peaks, and in the second one, we are getting 4 peaks. So why it is happening? So the spin interaction of neighboring hydrogens takes place through the covalent bonds that join there. So the neighboring uh, atoms will also be affecting its signal. So in this one, this is a ether. We only not only see the two unexpected resonance for two electrochemically different protons, but two sets of resonance. So one set is the quartet. So this is at the delta 3.4 ppm, and one is a triplet that is around 1.2 ppm. So why is this splitting is happening? So it is because of a parameter called J, that is the coupling constant. So when we do not do any coupling, so the peak will be single peak. But if we do a coupling, then it will dissociate into two peaks. So two different peaks will be coming. So here we have two nuclei HA and HB with different chemical shifts. Like one is at bonded with a highly electronegative atom. So when we apply an external magnetic field, the magnetic field will perturb, and due to that, the electron shift of boron and chlorine. So we have one side chlorine and one side boron and one side chlorine. So the electron shift of bromine and chlorine will affect the so magnetic field will perturb their shifts. So and each of the nuclei experience a slight different magnetic field depending upon the spin states. So HA experiences its local magnetic field enhanced or diminished by Hp, being being in one or other of its spin, like alpha or beta. Hence, the splitting pattern of HA is a doublet. So it can be either alpha or beta. And similarly for Hp, it will again split to a doublet. So that is why we are getting the two peaks, two splits. And another example is ethyl acetate. Ethyl acetate. So here HA will have 3 protons. So with no neighboring proton, therefore a single peak. So we do not have any neighboring proton here. So we get a single peak. But here we have for HB, let's consider HB here. So uh, it has the possibility like alpha alpha, alpha beta, beta alpha, or beta beta. So these have uh, so alpha alpha and beta beta will be requiring very high energy, and these alpha beta and beta alpha will be having equal energy. So the peak will be so there will be 4 peaks. So one, two, three, four. 4 peaks are there, and the intensity will be 1, 2, 2, 1. Sorry, 1, 3, 3, 1 basically. And for HC, for HC we have this kind of two protons, sorry, 3 protons, and having neighboring proton as SC. Okay, okay, I got confused between the HB and HC. So HB will be having uh, Hb itself has two protons which are neighboring with the three proton of Hc. So the signal will be alpha alpha alpha. Possibilities are alpha alpha alpha, alpha alpha beta, alpha beta alpha, beta alpha alpha. So these two will be having equal energy than beta beta beta. So these will be having peak intensity 1, then it is 3 3 and 1. And for Hc it is combined, it has three protons and it is having two neighboring protons of Hb. So the energy can be shown like this. It's triplet and 1 to 1, 1 is to 2 is to 1. This is the signal. So H1 it is having a singlet peak at 1.833 ppm. Then HB will be having a quartet signal at 3.9 ppm, and for the HC it is a triplet signal at 1.056 ppm. Then we have a n plus 1 rule. So suppose a set of hydrogen has n neighboring and non-equivalent hydrogen, it will split itself into n plus 1. So as we can see, so here it has two neighboring protons. The Hc will be having two neighboring protons. So it will split into 2 plus 1, that is 3 peaks. And here similarly, so this Hb is having 3 Hc protons. So it will be 3 plus 1 again, so 4 peaks. So that is how we are getting 4 peaks here. And for Ha, we do not have any proton associated with A, so we are getting only 0 plus 1, that is only singlet peak. So this is the Pascal's triangle. So you can calculate it for different number of hydrogen atoms. So suppose if it is if there are no neighboring atom or of hydrogen or no neighboring proton, then the n value will be 0. So n plus 1 will be equal to 1. That is a singlet. Then for n plus 1, we will get a doublet. For n plus 2, we will get a triplet. For 3, it is quartet. And likewise, you can calculate for different numbers of hydrogen, neighboring hydrogen atoms. So the Pascal triangle is used to determine the relative intensities of the lines. So intensities also we can calculate. So 1 plus 1 is 2, then that is how we calculate. So 1 plus 2 is 3 here, and 2 plus 1 is 3 again. And then we add these two, 1 plus 3 4, then 3 plus 3 6, and 3 plus 1 4. So likewise we can calculate what will be the intensity of the peaks for the for different number of n or hydrogens. So we can, that is why we know the these peak intensities. So as I have told that for a NMR of hydrogen, which is having a proton with zero neighboring hydrogen, so it will appear a single line. So as I told, so with the zero n, we will get a singlet peak. Then if we are having two lines of equal intensity, so because if we are having n equals to 2, so here if we put n equals to 1, that is the hydrogen atom is 1 in the neighboring side. So in that case, we will get 1 is to 1, that is 2 peaks with equal intensity in case of n equals to 1. And if we are putting n equals to 2, that means we get a triplet with intensity 1 is to 2 is to 1. So that is how we can get the details about the spectrum. So then, as I have told about the coupling constant, it is denoted by J. So here, and we can calculate it as A minus B cos phi plus C cos 2 phi. So this is the formula, but we do not need it much. We just need to know the coupling constant. Sometimes it is like we can get it from the literature also or in the peak. So here, as you can see, for this uh, particular compound molecule, we have so this peak at the middle is can be split into two, and we can get the J value of 6.1 hertz. So this is for triplet, and if we have a doublet, then it is 6.1 again, and it is coming at around 3.96 ppm for the doublet, and for a triplet it is coming out around 5.67 ppm. So that is the delta value, how it is changing, as I already told you. So the coupling constant is defined as the difference between the two adjacent sub peaks in the split signal. So the, the difference between the sub peaks means this is the middle peak and the sub peaks are these two. So the difference between these two. And if in a case of a doublet, we only have these two peaks, so the difference between the two peaks basically. So the size of the coupling constant J is usually between 0 to 15 hertz, and this means if set of peaks have spacing of greater than 15 hertz, then they are unlikely to be spin pattern. So if we have a peak which are so if we have multiple peaks, suppose like this, so the difference can be between 0 to 15 hertz. But if it is more than 15 hertz, then it might be a different peak, or that will be a different spin pattern. So that is not a part of a of this peaks, these single peaks. So I hope you understood. Like I'll draw it this way. So if a peak is coming like this, suppose, and then again one peak is coming like this. So the difference between these should be between 0 to 15. If it is more than 15, then so suppose for for this one, the difference will be more than 15 hertz. So in that case, we know that this peak is not sorry, this peak is not connected to the that peaks. So it is a different peak of different speed. That is not a combination of them. So that's what we can get. So that information we can get from it. So for a so we'll take another example of uh, this molecule that has bromine at one side, and so this again the split can be observed from here. And for the B atom, if we take the B atom, or the okay, for the B, it will split into uh, one, two, three triplets. Then again, that will again split into three, and the other two will be splitting into three, and this one again is split into three. So, but sometimes these two are very close to each other, these three also. So it won't give a different peak. It will give a single peak only. So that is how we can get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 peaks here. So here 3 and here 3 and then here 5. So this is for the B and this is for A and C. So that is how it happens. So we can so it should be, it's supposed to be 9 splits, but it will split into 5 only, because these are very close to each other, so it won't give a different peaks. Then the relaxation. So once uh, the nuclei will absorb some of the magnetic field, it will go to the excited state, as I've told. Then it will relax back. So that is the relaxation period, the time period. So the magnetization is the process of making a substance temporarily or permanently magnetic. That means uh, there will be no upon absence of the magnetic field, there will be no magnetization. Then it will be randomly oriented spin. And if there is a magnetization after applying after removing the magnetic field, then it is the permanent magnet. So the alignment will be there even after removing the magnetic field. But so in this case, how we are what we are doing, that upon applying the magnetic field, we do not get any magnetization, because there is, in the absence of magnetic field, there is no alignment with the magnetic field. But when we apply the magnetic field, we get a net magnetization. So that is the contribution of all the magnetic moments present in the nuclear. So in that case, the net magnetization M uh, is what we get for our material. So this can be so then once the magnetic field is removed, it will return back to the original state or equilibrium, that is called the relaxation. So the relaxation can be two types: spin lattice relaxation or spin relaxation. So the sequence of events in the NMR is application of 90-degree pulse, alter the population ratios, and create transverse magnetic field components. So uh, when we apply the magnetic field, the pulse that is 90-degree pulse, it will enter the population ratio. That means the number of nuclei at the lower level and at the higher level. So that ratio will be altered, and that will create a transverse magnetic field. So we will get a magnetic field in response to the application of our radio frequency which we applied. And the magnetization vector M will recover it until it reaches to its equilibrium value, that is M naught. So as can be seen here, so there initially there is no magnetization, but when we apply the magnetic field, we get a net magnetization M. So it has to come back to the equilibrium state after relaxation. So the magnetization vector will recover until it reaches to the equilibrium value, and that component of M decays exponentially with time constant T1 and T2. So T1 is for the spin lattice relaxation, and T2 is for the spin relaxation. And so these are different nomenclatures. So M naught is the net magnetization at equilibrium. So this is bulk along with the direction of the magnetic field, applied magnetic field, that is B naught. And C is the longitudinal direction, XY is the transverse direction. So spin lattice relaxation, that means T1, it is the longitudinal relaxation basically. So longitudinal means in the Z direction. Okay, so the longitudinal relaxation corresponds to the longitudinal magnetization recovery. So if the longitudinal reduction is due to the energy exchange between the spin and the surrounding lattice, that is the spin lattice relaxation, and it is reestablishing Boltzmann equilibrium. So as the spins go from higher energy state back to the lower energy state, the radio frequency energy is released back into the surrounding lattice. So that is what we call as spin lattice relaxation. So the excited nuclear spin will release the delta E amount of energy into the lattice, that is in the form of translations, rotations, or internal molecules, motions of the molecules. So this recovery is of longitudinal magnetization follow a exponential curve, and after time t1, longitudinal magnetization has returned to 63% of its value. Why 63%? That is calculated with the formula. And with 1.5 Tesla field strength, T1 value will be around 200 to 800 milliseconds. And T1 value is relatively long due to the lack of means of transfer energy to NMR transition into thermal energy. So it will take more time for the spin lattice relaxation. So as you can see in this direction diagram, the closely spaced energy levels are the rate of spontaneous emission, that is negligible. So it is around 10 to 25 per second. So that is very, it won't take much time for the spontaneous emission to take place. So the rate is very high. And the requirement of the energy transfer, the motion in the lattice must cause a fluctuating magnetic field at the site of the nuclear spin. So there should be a fluctuating magnetic field so that the lattice can move. So the motion can be translation, rotation, and internal motion can be happen in the molecule. So that is the lattice translation. So that translation has to happen, the fluctuating magnetic field has to be applied. And as for the observe RF pulse, the local fluctuating field must have a component of Larmor frequency, and only X and Y component of the local field can cause T1 relaxation. So the T1 relaxation can also be only be possible with the X and Y components. And the most common source of the local fluctuating field for spin is a direct dipolar interaction. And for a single crystal, other mechanisms are there. So with the interaction with unpaired electrons and interaction with electric field gradient for quadruple nuclei, this again can be a possible mechanism for the spin lattice relaxation. Then we have the transverse relaxation, that is spin relaxation. So this is denoted as T2. And the transverse relaxation can be in the direction of x and y, because the longitudinal one is the z axis, and the transverse relaxation happens in the xy plane. So transverse relaxation results from spins getting out of phase. So as spins move together, their magnetic field interact. So spin interaction will happen, and slightly modifying their precision rate. And these interactions are temporary and random. Therefore, the decay is perpendicular to the applied magnetic field. So magnetic field we are applying in the z direction, and the decay will be observed in the xy plane. So it is within the xy plane. So after a 90-degree pulse, the nuclear spins are aligned in one direction, and then but this arrangement is gradually lost. So up to 63% of its original value, and the T2 is shorter than the T1. So T1 will take long time to take place. So T1 relaxation is having taking much time, but T2 is taking shorter time with as compared to the T1. And since an increase in the Z magnetization without a decrease in the magnetization in the XY plane is not possible. So that is why the time taken is less. So this is also affected by the magnetic inhomogeneity. So if a material is not homogeneous in the sense of magnetization, so it will take so that the relaxation will depend in that. Yes. So this combination of relaxation and inhomogeneity is referred to the dephasing time, or T2 star also we can mention, right? So the T1 is dependent upon the dipolar interaction, and the T2 is dependent upon the so it is combination of relaxation and inhomogeneity. So it is referred as dephasing time sometimes. So as we can see, so in different directions in the xy plane, the relaxation can happen. Now integration. So integration is actually the area under the signal. So area under the NMR signal is proportional to the number of spin active nuclei which is causing the signal. So we can calculate the area under the curve or under the peak, and that we can calculate, and we can correlate it with the spin active nuclei numbers. So the number of active nuclei uh, can be determined with the help of the integration of the area. So if we have two or more separate resonances, and if we measure the areas under each resonance signal, we obtain the relative number of spin active nuclei for each resonance. So the area under the resonance signal are usually obtained by integration of the peaks, and this can be done electronically by the instrument, and the results are displayed either in steps. So as you can see, the steps are visible here, and this is the integration curve where the height of each step is proportional to the area underneath. So as you can see, the height is proportional to the area underneath for these peaks. So instrumentation for the NMR spectrometer has a, as we can see here, it has a sample holder, then a permanent magnetic coils, sweep generator, radio frequency transmitter, and so one is a transmitter and one is a detector. So the detector detects the absorbance spectra, and that is how we get the from the readout system we get the peak. So this is a basic instrumentation of the NMR, the spectrometer. So the sample holder is a glass tube which is having a length of 8.5 centimeter and dia of 0.3 centimeters. And so the permanent magnet, so this field depends upon our material, and so the commonly we use 60 to 100 megahertz, and but we can vary it upon depending upon our application. And then we have magnetic coils. These coils induce a magnetic field when current flows through them. Then sweep generator, it will produce an equal amount of magnetic field pass through the sample. Then radio frequency transmitter transmits the radio signals to the coil, and that produces a short powerful pulse of radio waves. Then the receiver collects the radio frequency emitted by the nuclei and upon relaxing to the lower energy level, and it will be recorded in the readout system, and that is how we can get the peaks in the system. So these are NMR tubes for solvent or liquid state spectroscopy. For determination of proton, sample must be dissolved in solvent which has no proton. So some of the solvents are CdCl3, CO, so deuterium and others. So for proton, we generally take 10 to 20 mg of sample, but for carbon samples, we need to take 50 to 100 mg of sample. And so for the characterization of polymers, we can analyze different things with the help of NMR. We can analyze the monomers, we can analyze the copolymer sequence, reaction products, or microstructures, whether it is isomerism. Tacticity also can be checked with the help of NMR. Then composition of a copolymer, branching in polyethylene, relaxation mechanism also we can check with the NMR. So here is an example of a monomer and a polymer. So this is a structure of the uh, caprolactone, which is having CdCl3 as a reference. So we are having CdCl3 here, and different peaks will be obtained for different protons. So proton at A having three peaks here. Then proton of B is having peaks something like this. So these two are B, and then C will be having again two peaks. So this B1 is having three peaks, and then again D1 is having two peaks. So likewise, we can uh, we can get distinct peak for different photons. And for a polymer like this, uh, so this is a polymer of this monomer, and in that case, it is a systematic arrangement of the this monomer chain. So here we can observe this is the peak for the reference CdCl3. Then we have for the uh, proton at A position we have peaks, three peaks here. Then for proton at B position we have these, and then again we have E position also, that is here. And for D the peaks are very less. Then for C position we are again getting three peaks. Then for PMMA, for different tacticity, we can get different peaks. So as we can see here, for the isotactic distinguishable patterns are there, AB patterns are there. Then for syntactic, indistinguishable singlets are there. And for atactic, it shows both characteristics, both singlet peaks and different other peaks also, distinguished peaks also are present in the tactic, in the atactic, because it is a mixture of both. So likewise, we can observe the with the help of NMR whether it is isotactic or syntactic or atactic. That will also give this information also we can get from NMR. So these are some of the elements which are represented with red color. These are having a half spin. So half spin is generally used because it is easy to analyze basically. We can still do for other samples also, but half spin is easy to understand and easy to analyze. That's why uh, we used half spin. But uh, the the only criteria is that the I should not be equal to 0. If it is 0, then this cannot be, this method cannot be used to characterize those elements. So the sensitivity of the signal depends upon the magnetic field, then temperature, and gyrometric ratio, natural abundance also. So the as we know, the proton is very highly abundant, proton and phosphorus. So these are having abundance of 99.9% and 100%. But again, their signal will vary. So the frequency of the signal are depending upon the multiple factors: their magnetic field, their gyrometric ratio. So for proton, we have very high gyrometric ratio, but for phosphorus, it is lesser. Silicon, it is in negative. So that is why the frequency will also vary. So the frequency will vary depending upon these factors. So magnetic field is proportional to the sensitivity is proportional to the magnetic field to the power 3 by 2, and sensitivity is inversely proportional to the temperature. So the temperature is very high, then the sensitivity will be less. Then barometric ratio, it is proportional to the cube of barometric ratio. So if it is so, as we see in the proton, the barometric ratio is very high. That's why upon taking its cube, the sensitivity will be even higher. So the frequency will also be higher. So likewise, we can uh, check like for uh, for our signal, our material to get better signal, what are the criteria. So for a carbon 13 spectra, so it is only as I told that the abundance also matters. For carbon, the abundance is only 1.1%. So that's why we need more quantity of samples. So 50 to 100 mg of sample is required in the case of carbon. So and the signal is also very weaker. It is 6,000 times weaker than the proton signal. So because of the less abundance, the we do not observe much spin-to-spin coupling and between the neighboring carbons, and therefore we cannot get much better signal. However, in the case of hydrogen, we get very good signal uh, as compared to carbon because it is highly abundant, and also the sample required is also very less in that case, and signal is also much stronger. Here are some of the examples for the different carbon, and so the it is basically a comparison between a carbon nuclei and a proton. So the carbon signal are spread over 200 delta units. So its spread is much higher, as we can see here, from 0 to 100 or even 200 it can go. So there is less chances of coincidence. So the peaks are kind of distinct, and these are more resolved than the proton. So here you can see the proton peaks are very close to each other. So it will take much of our uh, time to resolve those, and there are chances of overlapping the signals. So those are some of the examples for in case of a carbon. We need more amount of sample, but also we can get distinct peaks in the carbon spectrum. Then the chemical shift. So as I told, the range of delta is from 0 to 200. So at different ranges, we can get different for different function groups or elements. We can get different peaks. So that can be distinguished easily in the case of a carbon because it is stretched over up to 200 ppm. So that is the advantage of the carbon spectrum. So if any hydrogen is replaced by an electronegative atom, the signal will shift towards left. So as you can see here, the oxygen is an electronegative. Then so it will so more the electronegativity, it will shift more towards the left. That is the higher side, higher ppm. So this effect will decrease with the increasing distance from the electronegative atom. So if the chain is higher, then in that case the distance will decrease. The shift will lessen. Then now if we want to observe the carbon and hydrogen coupling, so heteronuclear coupling. So in that case, again the n plus 1 rule will be followed. And if we take this example of 2-butanol, so for this carbon, for the B1, we are having a quadrant. So for the methyl group, we are having a quadrant. So three hydrogen atoms means 3 plus 1, that is the n plus 1 rule. So if we have 3 atoms, 3 protons, then it is 3 plus 1, 4 peaks quadrant. That is what we are getting in the A1 and also in the B1 also. Sorry, B also. And then in the C, that is carbon with 2 protons. So 2 plus 1, that is 3. So n plus 1 again. So we'll get a triplet as seen here. And then for the D, it has only 1 proton. So n plus 1, according to n plus 1, we will get 1 plus 1, 2. So 2 doublet of equal intensities. And for solvent also, there is a peak. So that can be distinguished easily with the help of NM. So for unprotonated, we'll get a singlet. Then for 1 proton, we'll get a doublet. For 2 protons, triplet. And for 3 protons, it is quadruplet. So now if you want to decouple these, so here we are getting split in the curves. But if we decouple it, we'll get a distinct signals. So how it happens that the unwanted coupling is eliminated to simplify the spectrum by using decoupling technique, which are wherein simultaneous secondary RF irradiation takes place. So in the decoupling, we put a secondary RF irradiation, and that will minimize the coupling effect, and then we can get a one peak for a single atom or nucleon. So this RF has very broad frequency range, including all carbon and hydrogen excitation. That is proton resonance at 300 megahertz and carbon resonance at 45 megahertz. So in between these range, the broad frequency is will be having, and there then we can get the saturation of hydrogen occur and the rapid transition between the hydrogen between alpha and beta, which leads to the time averaged view between the two states. So that is how we do not get any coupled peaks. So that's why we'll get a single peak, because the saturation of hydrogen will occur and the transition will not take place. So the time will be averaged out and the two states appear to be one. So hence we do not spend sufficient time in getting the coupled peaks. So the time is less. So with that we will get a decoupled peaks. So some of the advantages of decoupling, it will simplify the spectrum, and also the nuclear overhaul effect. This effect is the transfer of nuclear spin polarization from one population of spin active nuclei to other via cross relaxation. So the enhancement occurs like this. So if the as we decrease the uh, number of protons, the Overhauser effect will enhance. So uh, and the peak intensity will be also be lesser. So in case of I told the point. In case of more number of protons, the effect will be higher. As we increase, it will decrease, and and the intensity also it will be decrease with the decrease in the number of hydrogen atoms. So the application, so these are used. So NMR for carbon can be used to determine the structure of different molecules. So suppose the arrangement is like this, AAA or AAB, BAA. So these kind of arrangement you can observe from the NMR spectrum, and we can check like whether which kind of arrangement is prominent in our molecule. Then branching also. So suppose a branching is there, then there will be a chemical shift. So if at one carbon atom the shift is this, like the value is this, and then for the fifth carbon the value will be lesser. So as with that we can observe the shift in our structure. So if the branching is taking place in our structure, then the shift can be determined from the NMR, and that can be correlated with the structure of what kind of structure can be present in the material. Then tacticity, again I have already told you, like with the different tacticity the peaks will be different. So for the first one, that is the isotactic, distinct peaks will be there. For syntactics, the mixture basically there will be no much distinct peaks, and for the heterotactic the sequence will be mixture of the both A and B. And it is also very good for determination of carbon nanoparticles, basically carbon uh, nanotubes or carbon dots, or those kind of nanomaterials can be characterized using the NMR. So the sp2 carbon and sp3 carbon, these peaks can be easily checked in the NMR. And the factors are which are affecting the NMR spectrum for single wall nanotube. For single wall nanotube, we can get for different diameters the peaks will be different, and for different functionalization the peak will different. So here, as we increase the diameter, the peak shift will occur. So the diameter of F1 is lesser than the F4, and it is reducing. So it is increasing. So with the increase in the as you can see, with the increase in the diameter, the shift is also there. So that is how we can observe that if there is a shift, then that means the diameter is higher. Also, for the functionalization, so if there is a sp2 carbon, the peak is present at 120 degrees around. So and it is having a very strong intensity. And if there are functionalization of nitrogen, suppose nitrogen or CO2, then it depends. So there are aliphatic carbons, and the shift will be around, and it will shift around 20 to 40 delta. So that depends on n, the number of carbon atoms chain, polymer chain. Then if we are having carboxyl groups, then it is around 170, as can be seen here. So here in this case, they have used a pristine single wall nanotube, and then they functionize it with different groups. So as we increase the number of this compound functionalization, then the shifting can be observed. Then for sp3 carbon attached to nitrogen, the peak will be at 80 ppm, and the intensity is very weak. And for sp3 carbon attached to fluorine, the delta will be at 90 ppm, and it is again weak. So that is how we can get an idea about the functionalization of our nanomaterial. Then annealing process. So different annealing process will give different width. Basically, that is the full width half maximum that we consider. So, uh, so the shift can be observed. Uh, not the shift, the broadening or thinning of the peak. That is what we can observe from the animal. So the full width half maxima, it is lower, like the peaks were not so broad. So that is lower. Then as we increase the annealing time, the broadening will take place, and that is what we can observe from these curves. Then for phosphorus, so again one of the most common material is phosphorus, and these are if we are talking about the polymer chemistry, then in the polymers we do not get like only rarely we have phosphorus in our polymer, but in the additives it is very abundantly present. So in that cases, if we have a additive or impurity in our sample, then in that case we need to know about the peaks of phosphorus in the animal. So it is used to study obviously the phosphorus containing compounds. So 31P is the having the high barometric ratio, that is 14.5%, is that of the proton, and it is 100% abundance. So the proton is having 99.9% abundance, and phosphorus is 31 phosphorus is having 100% abundance. So it will give a very high or strong peak. So this is a sample tube, and the difference goes inside the insert, and the sample goes and in the annulus space. So phosphoric acid is used as standard in the case of phosphorus, and its chemical shift is assigned to 0. And then the external standard, this is an external standard due to its high reactivity to phosphoric acid. So the material can be reactive to the phosphoric acid, so that's why we keep it in a inside insert. So this is not uh, mixing with the sample, it is inside one, and the sample is at the outside annular space. So but this is less sensitive as compared to the than the proton, but it is more sensitive as compared to the carbon. So this is basically having highly sensitive because it has high abundance, even more sensitive than the proton, but uh, it is less sensitive than the proton, but it is more sensitive as compared to the carbon. Then the concentration of the sample can be determined with the help of NMR, and it will require only 2 to 10 mg of sample because of its high abundance. And this sample, the solvent we use is non-deuterated. So again, we have different chemical shifts for phosphorus also. And for again for the electronegative elements, the peak shift will occur, and it will go up to from minus 150 to around 200 ppm. So the range is from minus 180, sorry, minus 180 to 250. Then another atom of our of great importance is the silicon, 29 silicon. So 29 silicon is magnetic, is having magnetic moment which is slightly lower than the carbon, 13 carbon. This leads to a lower resonance frequency. So, and also the chirometric ratio of silicon is also very less. It is minus 5.32, and the abundance is also very less, 4.7%. It has a spin of half and a magnetic moment of zero point 0.9 minus 0.96, and it has therefore it has a medium sensitivity. Okay, so these are some of the standard shifts for the silicon. Basically, these are the standard. Basically, TMS is generally used, tetramethylserine, but sometimes we use different standard also, because depending upon the application of our so the sample, depending upon the sample. So for the silicon, we do generally the, so these are the range for the chemical shifts for different groups for the electronegative compounds. So in the for the silicon, the solid state NMR analysis is the most common application. And so for the characterization of silicon filler, if you want to check, then so silicon O4 peak is assigned at minus 110 ppm, and the resonance can happen because of the selenol group and the geminal selenol group. So single selenol group will be having a shift peak at 100 ppm, and for the geminal selenol peak, the shift will be at around minus 90 ppm. So the peak are like this, at 110, minus 110, minus 100, and minus 90. So three peaks will be observed for a silicon filler. And also for the clay, so again with the different modification of the clay, so suppose we have a leponite RD, and with different modification the peaks will come, and uh, so the peak will be observed for different modification, and that we can determine with the referencing with the original standards, and we can assign those peaks to the different groups, and that is how we know that which peak is present at what place. Also for the microstructure of polysiloxanes, so if we want to determine, so for a benzene, so if silicon is attached with a benzene ring, the peak will be at around minus 47 ppm. So, and for silicon attached with methyl groups, then the peak will be around minus 20. Then for a silicon attached with methyl group, again it is coming around this minus 21, minus 22. This is for the methyl group and electronegative. So again for different like groups, for attachment with different groups, the different kind of peaks will be different places will be there for the peaks. So the origin of magnetic chemical shift. So this is depending upon the magnetic shielding of the NMR nucleus. We get if we apply a strong magnetic field in the XYZ direction, we could take a tensor, so second rank tensor. So that can be referred like this. So if it is a isotropic shield, we can get isotropic effect, that is 1 by 3 sigma 1 1 plus sigma 2 2 plus sigma 3. Then the shielding contribution will take place. So for diamagnetic shielding and paramagnetic shielding, both will be contributing towards the isotopic shielding value. So this is for the diamagnetic shielding, which is in the chemical environment does not appreciably affect the diamagnetic shielding for heavy metal atoms. And for a paramagnetic shift, the determination of this is required for the to determine the chemical shift trends. So for solid NMR, we will not get a very sharp peaks, but rather a broad peaks will be observed in the solid case. So because in the liquid, the natural averaging out will be happening, but in the solid state, the sample, the atoms are not moving that much. So the averaging out is this phenomena is not happening. That's why we are getting a broad peak. So these are so solid NMR is used for powders, single crystals, and amorphous samples and tissues. So the interactions which are present in the solid state are magnetic interaction with, depending upon the chemical shift or spin-spin coupling. So for the chemical shift, I told the isotropic chemical shift and anisotropy. Then for the spin-spin coupling, scalar coupling or dipole coupling. And the major interaction is Zeeman effect. Other interactions are also there, quadruple or chemical shift. But the major which is having high magnitude is the Zeeman effect. So anisotropy, already told the electron cloud is having certain kind of direction, and that is getting affecting the basically by the magnetic field which is applied to the sample, and that is how we get an anisotropy because of the electron density of the electron cloud of our atom. So depending upon the anisotropy, we will get a different magnetic field at different directions, and that is represented as a tensor here. So this is the anisotropic tensor that is also called principal axis system, represented by principal axis system. That is sigma 1 1, sigma 1 2, sigma 1 2. So one is 1, 2, and 3 are x, y, z respectively, and this is represented by a 3 cross 3 matrix. So the chemical shift anisotropy for a symmetrical, so if it is a spherical symmetry, we'll get both all sigma 1, sigma 2, sigma 3 equal, and in that case we will get a very sharp peak because of the high shielding. But if it is non-axial symmetry, then this will not be equal, and then we will get a very broad peak, and it is for different shielding in different in all the three dimensions. And then if it is axial symmetry, then two of the magnetic field will be equal and the other will be not equal. So in that case, we will get an asymmetric curve like this. So depending upon the arrangement of the molecule, if it is like this or like this, if it is perpendicular to the magnetic field, then maximum de-shielding will be there. And if it is parallel to the magnetic field, the maximum shielding will be there. So less energy here. So for solid state NMR, we have asymmetric tensor and symmetric tensor. So as I have told that if it is aligned to the magnetic field, we'll get a peak at lower energy, and if it is taking less of angle when aligning with the shield, then so it will keep on increasing. If it is perpendicular to the magnetic field, obviously the peak will come at higher energy. So if it is a combination of all three, we'll get a peak like this. So this one is for the aligned one or the shielded one, which is coming at a lower frequency, and for the de-shielded one, we'll get at the peak at a higher frequency. Similarly, for actually asymmetric tensor, at different orientation, we'll get a different peak, and it can be represented like this. So all three will be having different values. Here these two will be having equal value, delta 1 1 and delta 2 2, and delta 3 3 will be lesser than delta 1 1 and 2. So for isotropic value, so this is the at the center of gravity of the components. So here we know that delta 1 1 is greater than delta 2 2, and which is greater than delta 3 3. So the isotropic peak will come over here, and the difference between the delta 2 2 and the delta isotropic is the skew of the tensor. So this is represented by K. So the K is the skew of the tensor. So in this case, it is 0.3, that is plus 0.3. For actually symmetric tensor, it is in this case. So here delta 1 1 is equal to delta 2 2. So it will come in this side, and again the difference is plus 1. And if it is coming in the opposite direction, so the if delta 2 2 is equal to delta 3 3, in that case it is minus 1. So the skew will be the difference between the delta iso and the delta 2 2. And the omega is the span of the maximum width. So this is the maximum width of the peak. This is the span that is denoted by the omega. That is the maximum width of the pattern. So again, dipolar coupling, as I've told, it is dependent upon the coupling also. So dipolar coupling is the interaction of one nuclear spin with a magnetic field generated by another nuclear spin and vice versa. So the interaction of one nuclear spin, as you can see here, with the magnetic field generated by the another one. So the another one, the other nuclear will be having a spin, and that will be affecting with the spin of the different nucleus. So vice versa, that dipolar coupling will happen, and it is orientation dependent. It is a direct through space interaction, and it can be calculated like this. So we can calculate the RJK value with the help of this formula, and the dipolar coupling constant also can be calculated using this formula. Then the magic angle spinning. So in the solid state, basically we need to check the magic angle, because in that position only we will get a maximum peak signal or higher signal to noise ratio. So if we want to get a better signal, we need to spin our material at the magic angle to get a better resolution of the beats. So it is used to average this chemical shift anisotropy or the heteronuclear dipolar interaction. So this can be calculated using this formula, as I told, and the rate of the magnetic angle spin must be greater than or equal to the magnetic magnitude of the anisotropic interaction. So these are at different angles. We'll get different peaks, as can be seen here, and also that also depends upon the frequency. So at different applied radio frequency, we'll get uh, different peaks, and then we can with multiple with like uh, with the variation of the radio frequency, we'll get to know like at what peak, what frequency will get better peaks. So here at 583 we are getting more number of peaks, so that is the best for our sample in this case for the phosphorus sample. Then I'm running out of time, so I'm skipping the slides. So now coming to the questions. uh, yeah, so suppose this is a question for, like, suppose we have two nucleus. So one is proton and one is 13 carbon, are two of the most common nuclides studied by high field NMR spectroscopy due to their abundance in human tissue. Other isotopes that have been studied include these, and based on this information, which of the following nuclide will not be considered suitable for use with NMR spectroscopy? So can anyone tell me the answer for this one? Which among these will not be suitable for the NMR spectroscopy?
2H.
Yeah. Uh, Basically, also if here we can also write 20 Ne also, because that is also not suitable. But I think there is some confusion here. 2H is suitable because it has spin quantum number 1. So this is suitable. But the Ne one, the Ne is not suitable because it does not have any spin. If you see in this table, uh, can you find the Ne? I think that is not mentioned over here. Can you are you able to check, like, it is there? So that is neon basically. Neon is having 3 by 2, but uh, the 29 Ne that is mentioned here. What was that slide? Yeah, 20 Ne. This is not active in animal, so that's why the answer is 20 N. So you have made an NMR sample of 600 microliter volume and 1 millimolar concentration. Determine how many protons do you have in your sample. Assuming each molecule has only one proton. So can anyone calculate this 100 microliter and of NMR sample and having a concentration of 1 millimolar? So we need to find out the number of protons in the sample. Should I go to the solution?
Just how it will be calculated, just any.
Okay. So the solution is so here we have total volume of 600 microliter. If we convert it into liters, it is 600 into 10 to the power minus 6, and molar. So it is 1 millimolar. So that means 1 into 10 to the power minus 3 molar. So number of moles are volume into the molarity. So 600 into the molarity, that is 1. And so number of molecules, so this is number of moles, and then we want to check the number of protons, that is the number of molecules. So n into the number of molecules, n is the Avogadro number. So if we put this value here, we'll get the number of protons with this relation, and it is coming around 3.6 into 10 power 7. You can calculate. This is divide here.
Okay.
Are you able to calculate it? Here, a division will be mentioned. Let me know when you are done. I'll move to the next question. Hello.
Madam, can we get your slides, madam? PowerPoint slides.
Yes, yes, I will upload these slides.
Okay. Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I will upload these slides. You will get the slides.
Can you share with this, ma'am?
Sorry.
This, your presentation slide, madam.
Yeah, yeah. I will.
Actually,
I will share these
okay.
slides. Don't worry.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So, have you finished noting down this one? Shall I move to the next one?
We'll go to next one.
So the next question is, which of the following statement most accurately describe the aromatic portion of the NMR spectra of the distributed benzene compound depicted below? So here we have the benzene ring, which is having a methyl group and a halogen attached with it. So which among the following is correct for this? So all three compounds have NMR spectrum with 4 distinct peaks. Then the meta compound produces an NMR spectrum with 1 singlet and 1 triplet and 2 doublets. The ortho compound produces an NMR spectrum with 1 doublet, 2 triplet, or none of the above. So for your information, this is the meta position, and this is the ortho position, and this is the para position. sorry, this is the ortho position here, and this is the para position, meta position, and the downward is the para position. I will write it down here. So this is ortho, then this is meta, and this is para here. So para is not involved in this case. I will remove it down. Here we do not have any para groups. So only we have ortho and meta. Anyone can answer this, or should I move to the answer? Okay, I shall move. So answer B is the correct. The meta compound will produce a spectrum with one singlet, one triplet, and two doublets. So, uh, like, can anyone explain how it is happening?
No idea, please.
Okay. So here we have a benzene ring, that is the aromatic compound, and we have a methyl group and uh, yeah. So a methyl group and a halogen attached. So which one is the meta compound? Can anyone tell me? If we have a benzene ring, so this position is ortho, this position is meta, and this position is the para. This is a benzene. So which one among these? And this is with respect to the sorry, with respect to the functional group attached over here. So in this case, which one is the meta one? Can anyone tell? So if the compound is if the halogen is attached at the ortho position, basically this is the ortho one, because here we have R group, that is the methyl group, and this halogen is attached at the ortho position. Then if we have, sorry, so I think this is confusing. I will remove these two. So then this is in the opposite direction. So one methyl group is present here and the halogen is in the opposite direction. That means in this case, this is at the para position. This is the para compound, and this is the ortho compound, and then this is the meta compound, because there is a gap of uh, one vertex, and then this is the meta position with respect to the R group. So this is the meta position. So now here this is the meta compound, and with for this particular compound we will get one singlet, one triplet, and two doublets. How it is happening? So one singlet means that is for the overall compound. One triplet because 2 plus 1. So here there will be two protons. So two protons uh, plus 1. So we'll get a triplet and two doublets. So this is for the R3. So three. I'm sorry. So we have for the hydrogen, we'll get three protons here, and those are combined with 1 1, so we'll get 2 doublet, 2 plus 1 plus 1 2. So those are combined with the 2 and we'll get a doublet of 2. So that is how we'll be able to get the spectrum. I think it is clear. Or should I draw it? So we are checking not for the carbon, we are checking for the hydrogen atom, basically. So the answer is we'll get one singlet for the hydrogen and one triplet and two doublets. So why one singlet? I think I should write it down here. So if this is for n equals to 0, that means 0 hydrogen, neighboring hydrogen in the case of this bond. Then we'll get one triplet because of the two hydrogen atoms. So n equals to 2. So here in this case n equals to 2, and then here we'll get two doublets. So 2 of n plus n equals to 1. So n plus 1 rule will be followed, and we'll get n plus 1 peaks. So 1 plus 1 2. So 2 for doublets and one singlet and one singlet. So now next question is, assume that a proton is a scalar coupled to protons with different chemical environments. If this proton show a triplet, how many protons it is scalar coupled to? So again here the same n plus 1 will be followed. So can anyone guess the answer?
2.
Yeah. So again n plus 1, that is 2 plus 1, triplet signal will be obtained. So answer is B. Now deuterated solvent in the NMR sample is used. So this is for to stabilize the magnetic field, obtain good field homogeneity across the sample, set the uniform radio frequency, or all of the above. Any guesses?
Yeah, stabilize the magnetic field.
Okay, let's see. Yeah. So basically this is used for the solid state samples. So deuterated solvents, not for the solid state, sorry, the phosphorus one, phosphorus sample. So in that case, deuterated solvents are used to stabilize the magnetic. Okay, so this is the end of the session. So with, if you have any other doubts, you can ask or you can put them in. Any questions? I think there is no question, so you can pick.
No, please.
Thank